The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Thank you, Betty, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. The theme of this conference, as all of you know, is social action as spiritual practice. Now, I'm going to talk about both of those things this evening, but I'm going to approach them from four different standpoints. I'm going to approach them from the standpoints of the Theosophical Society, of theosophy, of individual theosophists, and finally of the Theosophical Order of Service. What I'm going to say about these items, I am now going to summarize in 4 sentences. So once I've said those, if you feel some intense need to go someplace else, you've heard it all. Sentence 1. The Theosophical Society is not a social action organization. And it takes no part in activities with political implications. Moreover, as an organization, its goal is spiritual practice to change the way people see the world and themselves. Second sentence. Theosophy has implications for how we live and what we do with our lives. Third sentence. Individual theosophists have applied their understanding of theosophy in some quite vigorous forms of social action. Fourth sentence. The Theosophical Order of Service has as its purpose the fostering of action based on theosophical principles. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Everything else will be footnotes. Well, let's begin with a footnote on spiritual practices. Spiritual practices can be put into 2 categories: world-evading or world-embracing. World evaders might include Chinese Taoists, Hindu sannyasis, and Christian hermits, those who want to withdraw from the world. World embracers might include Chinese Confucianists, Mahayana bodhisattvas, and Christian friars, those who go out and work in the world. Much depends, to be sure, on the intention or the mindset and the practices of the individual, which are far more important than sectarian or nominal categories. Yet these 2 orientations of world evaders and world embracers are real ones. The orientation of these 2 attitudes derives from 2 judgments about the nature of life. One judgment says that life is disintegrated, evanescent, and painful, and therefore it is something to be escaped from, if it is all possible to do so. The other judgment says that life is wholeness, awareness, and bliss, and is therefore something to be joyfully entered into. Now, which judgment is right? The answer to that is don't ask stupid questions. Obviously, both attitudes are right, but in different ways and with different focuses. However, which of those two judgments we operate by is a powerful determinant of the response we make to the world. A Chinese example can illustrate these differences. A key concept in Chinese thought is Wu Wei. Now, Wu Wei means literally not doing. But Wu Wei is a very complex concept. It can be interpreted negatively as meaning we should refrain from action. But it can also be interpreted positively as implying that we should merge ourselves with the impersonal action of the cosmos. In the latter interpretation, Wu Wei has something in common with an ideal from the Bhagavad Gita, in which Sri Krishna talks about nishkama karma, a Sanskrit phrase which means action without desire. Incidentally, a friend of ours once said the problem with most people is not that they engage in nishkama karma, or action without desire, but that they engage in nishkama karma. That is to say, desire without action. But this sense of Wu Wei, of being nishkama karma, or action without desire, has something in common with recent Western ideals of going with the flow or being in the zone. You all are familiar with both of those, I'm sure, from recent news reports of golf, among other subjects. In that and incidentally, that's something that all of us probably have experienced. Haven't you ever been in an action, have you ever been doing something where you became so involved in the action that you forgot about yourself, you didn't have to think about what you were doing, you just did it and you did it right? As a matter of fact, this is typical of many actions. How many of you ride bicycles? All right, now when you ride a bicycle, do you think about how you are balancing yourself on that very improbable vehicle? What happens if you start to think about how you are balancing yourself on a bicycle? You'll fall off, right? It has to be Wu Wei. It has to be in the zone. It has to be going with the flow. You are part of the action. Now, this unified action, and we could translate, I think, Wu Wei or nishkama karma as unified action rather than not action. This unified action is what T.S. Eliot talks about in his poem Burnt Norton, where he is thinking about the revolving of our solar system, our galaxy, and the cosmos as the whole as a gigantic universal dance. In Burnt Norton, Eliot says, "At the still point of the turning world, there the dance is. But neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement toward nor from, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance." Unified action is also what William Butler Yeats talks about in his poem Among School Children. At the end of that poem, he affirms that the actor and the action are always one. He says, "O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? There is no dancer apart without a dance. There is no dance without a dancer. They are one. Wu Wei is being at the still point. It is being one with the dance of life. However, as we think of it, we can concentrate on either the motionless center or the revolving circle. Eliot focuses on the center. Yeats on the revolving dance. Similarly, in China, Lao Tzu focused on withdrawal and Confucius on engagement. Lao Tzu thought that any participation in worldly affairs was pointless. Legend has it that he was the archivist in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty. But he became disillusioned with the corruption of society. So he decided to abandon all human connections and to travel westward, just like Frodo leaving Middle-earth with the elves. But as Lao Tzu was leaving the country, a border guard detained him and asked him to write down his teachings before he went off into the West. And Lao Tzu obliged by composing the 5,000-character Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way and its Power. And that little book presents the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, which emphasizes doing nothing oneself, and thus allowing the Tao, the way of the universe, to work without obstruction. The theory of the Tao Te Ching is that when you and I set out to do something, to accomplish something, all we're doing is messing up the way of the universe. So best just back off and let the universe work. On the other hand, Confucius thought that the purpose of spiritual practice was to prepare oneself for activity in civil government. The great sorrow of Confucius's life was that he was not able to persuade any of the rulers in China that all of the preparation he had gone through qualified himself to be an important government official. Actually, none of the rulers of China trusted Confucius for a moment because he was a completely honest man. Confucius embraced the concept of Wu Wei as an injunction to follow the way of heaven rather than one's own personal desires, but to do so actively by participating in government and society. Lao Tzu and Confucius honored the same concept of Wu Wei, but they differed in emphasis and application. Taoists emphasized the still point and world evading. Confucians emphasized the dance and world embracing. Now, as this conference is a theosophical convention, the question arises, which is theosophy? At the still point or in the dance? Eliotish or Yeatsian? Taoist or Confucian? World evading or world embracing? Hands off or social action? Of course, the answer to that question will depend upon the individual theosophist, primarily because a primary principle of theosophy is the freedom of the individual. The theme of this conference, however, clearly implies that its organizers' view of that question is that theosophy is involved with social action. However, we might say that the conference theme could be put either way. Social action as spiritual practice, or spiritual practice as social action. If both spiritual practice and social action are done in certain ways, they can amount to the same thing. In choosing this conference theme, its organizers took it from a central theosophical tradition, because theosophy sees the world process not as a mistake, not as an evil to be avoided, but rather as life's means of achieving greater subtlety, awareness, and unity. Yet two caveats are necessary, because both Theosophy and the Theosophical Society have some reservations about equating spiritual practice and social action. Those reservations need to be kept in mind in our discussion of this conference theme. Now, first, let's talk for a moment about the reservation the Theosophical Society has about equating spiritual practice and social action. A basic principle of the Society is that it does not engage in any political activities or endorse any political policies. Therefore, inasmuch as social action is a political activity, the Theosophical Society as such cannot embrace it. This is simply a consequence of the Society's position that individual members of the Society have the unfettered freedom and responsibility to make judgments and commitments according to their own consciences. The Society does not tell its members what to do, apart from a general acceptance of the Society's three objects. The Society puts a primary value on freedom of individual belief and action as long as such belief and action is in accordance with its three objects, which Betty pronounced early in this program. But again, I will repeat them. The first is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. The second is to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. And the third is to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. Now, quite early in the last century, an auxiliary body, the Theosophical Order of Service, was formed to provide an organization for those who wanted to engage in collective social action of various specific kinds. The TOS, as it is familiarly known, shares the general ideals of the Theosophical Society, but is organizationally distinct, being a group that acts to realize those shared ideals in practical ways. Now, two persons may share ideals, but not agree on particular ways to apply or actualize them. So members of the TOS exercise their freedom by applying theosophical ideals to various forms of social action without committing the society or its other members to those particular applications. All right, now what are the reservations of Theosophy about equating spiritual practice and social action? The teachings of Theosophy have always distinguished between material and spiritual problems. It is clear that the world is beset by a vast array of material and social problems: poverty, preventable disease, hunger, sexual and economic exploitation, injustice, inequity, and unfairness, persecution, war, tribalism, sectarianism, prejudice, and so on and on and on. The horsemen of the apocalypse are always with us. Simple humanity requires that we respond to such problems. It is unthinkable that we should not respond to them. Yet those problems are only the surface symptoms of an underlying disease. Disease symptoms must be alleviated. But if nothing more is done than treating the symptoms, the disease will remain, and the same symptoms, or even worse ones, will develop. To remove, not just alleviate the symptoms, the cause of a disease must be identified and treated. Then the disease will be cured, and its symptoms will automatically clear up and disappear. Now, what is the disease that produces the material and social problems plaguing humanity? Theosophy maintains that the disease is spiritual ignorance. The disease is the belief that you and I are separate and disconnected. It is the belief that all living beings on earth and throughout the cosmos are separate and disconnected. It is the belief that I can act in my own interest without concern for how my actions affect you. Theosophy holds that both the material health and spiritual health of each of us and of all beings depend on a quite different belief, namely that there is only one life in the cosmos, one intelligence, one reality. Each apparently separate and individual life is but an articulation of that one reality. And therefore, every action of every individual affects the whole cosmos. Every being is inextricably related with every other being in the universe. And the actions each of us does inevitably affects all others. Now, all of us tend to behave not as though we believe that, but rather as though we believed we could do something to benefit ourselves that will not affect anyone else, or if it does affect anyone else, that effect will have no consequences for us. The truth is otherwise. One of the great teachers in the Theosophical tradition has said this: your karma, good or bad, being one and the common property of all mankind, nothing good or bad can happen to you that is not shared by many others. There is no happiness for one who is ever thinking of self and forgetting all other selves. Would you be partakers of divine wisdom or true theosophists? Then do as the gods when incarnated do. Feel yourself the vehicles of the whole humanity, mankind as part of yourself, and act accordingly. The truth of that statement rests on the first object of the Theosophical Society, which asserts the existence of the universal brotherhood of humanity. It also rests on the first fundamental proposition of Madame Blavatsky's big book, The Secret Doctrine, which proposes the unity of all existing beings grounded in one ultimate underlying reality. It is ignorance of the facts of universal brotherhood and of the ultimate unity of all life that is the cause of the symptoms of the human disease. Those symptoms must be alleviated, and it is the aim of social action to alleviate them. But it is the aim of theosophy to cure the disease by eliminating its cause, ignorance of the reality of human and cosmic unity. Madame Blavatsky, one of the two chief founders of the Theosophical Society, was very clear about these matters, as 4 passages from her book, The Key to Theosophy, demonstrate. In one passage, she says, "Now, true evolution teaches us that by altering the surroundings of the organism, we can alter and improve the organism. And in the strict sense, this is true with regard to man. Every theosophist, therefore, is bound to do his utmost to help on, by all the means in his power, every wise and well-considered social effort which has for its object the amelioration of the condition of the poor." In another statement from that same book, she says, "As individuals, each is left perfectly free to follow out his or her particular line of political thought and action, as long as this does not conflict with theosophical principles." And in a third statement, she says, "To seek to achieve political reforms before we have effected a reform in human nature is like putting new wine into old bottles. Make men feel and recognize in their inmost hearts what is their real, true duty to all men, and every old abuse of power, every iniquitous law in the national polity, based on human, social, or political selfishness, will disappear of itself. No lasting political reform can ever be achieved with the same selfish men at the head of affairs as of old." And finally, she says, "How then should theosophical principles be applied so that social cooperation may be promoted and true efforts for social amelioration be carried on? Let me briefly remind you," she says, "what these principles are: universal unity and causation, human solidarity, the law of karma, reincarnation. These are the 4 links in the golden chain which should bind humanity into one family, one universal brotherhood." Now, those things which she calls links in the golden chain are 4 core principles that apply to and motivate social action. We might paraphrase them as follows. First, everything that exists is an expression of one underlying reality: the universe is a whole. Second, all human beings are members of one single family. We are all our brother's keepers, and all human beings are our brothers. Third, every action we do reacts on ourselves and on all other members of the family and on all the universe as a whole. And fourth, we live in a world we have made by our previous actions, and we will return again to live in the world we are now making by our actions, so we can improve our future worlds and ourselves by what we do now. I am reminded here of the wise words of the Rabbi Hillel, who said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself alone, what am I? If not now, when?" A simpler paraphrase of these 4 links of the golden chain, these 4 central notions, might be 4 single words: wholeness, brotherhood, responsibility, and improvement. All of the other core principles are implicit in the first one: which affirms the unity, wholeness, and interconnectedness of the universe. The interconnectedness of all things has been expressed in every great mystical tradition of the world and by all the great poets as well. Thus, the English poet Francis Thompson, who is best known as the author of The Hound of Heaven, a poem some of you I'm sure know, Francis Thompson wrote these lines in his collection of poems entitled Mistress of Vision. All things by immortal power, near or far, hiddenly to each other linked are, that thou canst not stir a flower without troubling of a star. That concept is also expressed in what is sometimes called the butterfly effect in chaos theory. A meteorologist named Edward Lawrence was studying the knock-on effects of weather changes and discovered to his amazement that the world is so complexly interrelated that cause and effect relationships cannot be predicted confidentially. Can you imagine that? Anyone who reads weather forecasts, I think, would already know that. The example he cited is this. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing in March, then by August, hurricane patterns in the Atlantic will be completely different from what they would otherwise have been. Cause and effect are real, but their interconnections are so complex that they defy prediction. All things, near or far, to each other linked are. From the first principle of wholeness, the second principle of brotherhood follows, because you and I are linked to one another. And also the third principle of responsibility follows, because every action we do affects the whole world. And finally, the fourth principle of improvement is implicit, because we live in a world created by our interlinked actions of the past and the present, and thus we can improve the world. Despite the unpredictability of the butterfly effect, we certainly must do whatever we can to help others in immediate material ways. Yet ultimately, the only effective result will be achieved by a transformation of consciousness. That transformation involves a realization of those four core principles: wholeness, brotherhood, responsibility, improvement. That realization cannot be merely intellectual. It must be behavioral. And that transformational realization is the aim of Theosophy. Thus, Theosophy calls upon us to spread knowledge of the core principles as the most effective form of social action. The result is spiritual practice as social action. The theosophical life is traditionally said to have three aspects: study, meditation, and service. By study, we come to understand the nature and implications of the four core principles. By meditation, we incorporate those principles into the deepest levels of our consciousness and into the very fabric of our being. By service, we act upon those principles in our daily lives. In putting those principles into action, all fellows of the Theosophical Society are free to engage in whatever form of social activity they find compatible with the Society's three objects. The Society itself does not engage in social action, other than spreading knowledge of the core principles and their implications. But it leaves its members free to follow their own consciences in all such matters. Historically, individual theosophists have vigorously embraced various forms of social action as expressions of their spiritual practice. Two notable examples are the founder president, Henry Steele Alcott, and the Second International president, Annie Besant, both of whom were engaged in seeking justice for the deprived. For example, Alcott became a hero in Sri Lanka by appealing to the British government in defense of the civil rights of Sri Lankans and by supporting their education and cultural pride. He founded schools for Buddhists in Sri Lanka and for outcasts in India. He was a prime mover for the Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka, India, Burma, and Japan. He became famous for his healing techniques, as documented by Michael Gomes in his 2007 Blavatsky lecture on Colonel Alcott and the Healing Arts, and such service was always freely given. Alcott was not a theoretician, but a man of practical action, as he himself acknowledges in his autobiographical work, Old Diary Leaves, in which he writes these words: "Somehow or other, I have never found time for self-training in yoga since I took up my line of practical work in our Theosophical movement. I never seemed to care whether I acquired any psychical powers or not, never aspired to guruship, nor cared whether I could or could not attain liberation in this lifetime. To serve mankind always seemed to me to be the best of yogas, and the ability to do even a little towards spreading knowledge and diminishing ignorance an ample reward. So it never entered my mind in the early days that I might train myself as a seer or a wonder worker, a metaphysician or an adept. But I have been going on all these years on the hint given to me by a master that the best way to seek them was through the Theosophical Society. A humble sphere, perhaps, yet one well within my limited capabilities, thoroughly congenial, and at the same time, useful." Colonel Alcott's last message, written on his deathbed, sums up the ideals and aspirations of his life. Just a few days before he died, he produced these words: "To my beloved brothers in the physical body, I bid you all farewell. In memory of me, carry on the grand work of proclaiming the living brotherhood of religions. To my beloved brothers on the higher planes, I greet and come to you and implore you to help me to impress on all men on earth that there is no religion higher than truth, and that in the brotherhood of religions lies the peace and progress of humanity." Like Colonel Alcott, Annie Besant, his successor as the Second International President of the Theosophical Society, did social action as spiritual practice her whole life. In England, she worked for the poor, the disenfranchised, and the exploited. She organized the 1888 match girl strike of women and teenage girls who worked 14-hour days with poor pay under dangerous and unhealthful conditions. In India, she became a national hero by supporting self-rule and promoting the education and protection of women. She became the first woman and the first non-Indian to head the Indian National Congress, the country's major political party. In 1908, the year after she became president of the Theosophical Society, Annie Besant founded the Theosophical Order of Service. Annie Besant was attuned to an injunction in the spiritual classic entitled The Voice of the Silence, which says, "Let not the sun, the fierce sun, dry one tear of pain before thyself hast wiped it from the sufferer's eye." That injunction was the inspiration of her life. Adlai Stevenson, after a distinguished career of other national service, became the American ambassador to the United Nations. Do any of you remember Adlai Stevenson? Oh, bless you. In the United Nations, he gave an address after the death of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his great inspiration. In it, he praised the former First Lady by paraphrasing a Chinese proverb. He said, "She would rather light candles than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." That saying is familiar to all of you, isn't it? Adlai Stevenson introduced it into the English language. That praise is equally applicable to Annie Besant, another great lady whose glow has warmed the world. And Annie Besant's glow shines notably through the Theosophical Order of Service. The motto of the Theosophical Order of Service is, "A union of those who love in the service of all that suffers." Now, the grammar of that motto is important. Some people have suggested that it should be corrected. They're wrong. It's right as it is. The final phrase is singular, "in the service of all that suffers." One might have expected there the plural, "in the service of all that suffer." Surely there are more sufferers than one. So why is the singular used? The grammar is not a mistake, but correctly reflects the Theosophical first core principle. All life is one. If any single living being suffers, all of us suffer. Suffering is not isolated, but shared and common. The suffering of each of us is the suffering of all of us. In our core self, we are all one self. So whatever happens to any of us affects all of us. All things, near and or far, to each other linked are. The Theosophical Order of Service exists to serve the suffering life of the world. The suffering of the world may be physical pain or deprivation. It may be isolation or anxiety. It may be injustice, cruelty, or oppression. It may be the exploitation of animals. It may be the ravaging of the environment. It may be military violence. In response to all varieties of suffering, the Theosophical Order of Service provides an opportunity to serve. That is, the TOS offers a way of applying what has been learned by study and internalized by meditation. Remember, the three aspects of the theosophical life are study, meditation, and service. In the recently published Theosophical Encyclopedia, Diana Dunningham-Chapotin, the International Secretary of the Theosophical Order of Service, writes that an early statement about the TOS phrased its purposes as the following. 1, to minimize the sum of misery in the world. 2, to forget self in working for others. 3, to eliminate selfishness and substitute love as the rule of the world. 4, to live to the highest that is within us. Those purposes connect serving others with bettering oneself, improving the world, and coming into touch with the divine spark at the core of our being. You know, people sometimes wonder whether it's better to try to help others, even if we are flawed ourselves, or to spend all of our effort at work to improve ourselves, our own characters first. Can flawed beings, such as all of us are, really help in improving others? Isn't that an arrogance? However, the fact is that the best way to help ourselves is to forget about ourselves and concentrate on others instead. When I first came into the presidency of the Theosophical Society in America, I discovered, to my surprise and to my dismay, that some people expected me to be a father confessor and to give them spiritual advice about their problems. Now, when somebody comes to you with their problems and asks for help in dealing with them, you cannot follow what my first impulse was, namely to say, I don't have the faintest idea what you should do. That would not do. Luckily, I quickly realized that most of the problems brought to me were caused by self-centeredness. The suffering souls were thinking too much about themselves. So my advice was frequently that they should get involved with helping others so that they had less time to worry about themselves, although I never actually said that. And by and large, it seemed to work. The best way to help oneself is to help others. That is not a paradox, but a truism. The Voice of the Silence, that spiritual guidebook that inspired Annie Besant, talks about 2 paths in one. And this is what it's talking about. Serving others and helping oneself are not 2 separate paths. They are one and the same. Another spiritual guidebook, Light on the Path, tells us that by working to lift a little of the heavy karma of the world, we improve ourselves and lift some of our own karma. Improving the karma of others and ourselves at the same time is also the path to realization of the one self in the universe. Thus, the Theosophical Order of Service is an organization for doing good in the world, but it is more than that. It is actually a spiritual path, a form of yoga for theosophists. By acting dispassionately, remember the Gita's Nishkama Karma, action without desire. By acting dispassionately, we forget our little personal selves as we minimize the sum of misery in the world. That promotes love and confidence in divine goodness as the rule of the world. And that in turn brings us to a realization of the highest that is within us. The Bhagavad Gita expounds 3 yogas: Karma Yoga, the way of action; Bhakti Yoga, the way of devotion; and Jnana Yoga, the way of knowledge of who we are and what the world is. The message of the Gita is that all 3 yogas are interconnected. The Theosophical Order of Service provides a contemporary version of the 3 paths in one. Now, the paths to the highest are multiple. The Theosophical Order of Service is open to theosophists and non-theosophists alike. But it is not the only way to serve. Traditional Christianity talks about works of both corporal and spiritual mercy. Are those phrases familiar to anybody? Anybody ever go to a Jesuit school? Yeah, then you know about those. Corporal mercy includes feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, harboring the homeless, visiting the sick, ransoming the captive, and burying the dead. That is social action. Spiritual mercy includes instructing the ignorant, advising the doubtful, admonishing wrongdoers, bearing injustice patiently, forgiving offenses, comforting the afflicted, and praying for the living and the dead. That is spiritual practice. Both sorts of mercy are needful. Both social action and spiritual practice are called for. The Theosophical Order of Service aims at treating the symptoms of the world's ills. Its American branch has departments of animal welfare, art and music, ecology, family and children, healing, peace, and social service. The TOS participates in disaster relief, most recently, especially in the tsunami, which a couple of years ago swamped Southeast Asia. And it fosters individual initiative in ministering to all that suffers. It offers social action as a form of spiritual practice. The Theosophical Society aims at curing the cause of the world's ills. It seeks to awaken those who are asleep to the core principles of wholeness, brotherhood, responsibility, and improvement. Its objects are to form a nucleus of brotherhood, to encourage study of diverse cultures, and to investigate the unknown around us and inside us. It offers spiritual practice as a form of social action. Both social action and spiritual practice are essential, and each implies the other. Social action is just do-good busyness unless it is grounded in an enlightened spiritual practice. And spiritual practice is just an exalted form of selfishness unless it manifests itself in practical social action. Social action and spiritual practice are the two poles of a dynamo that can energize and empower the world. Not everyone can work with both poles equally. Many of us have to concentrate our efforts on one or the other, according to our talents and our proclivities. But in deciding how we will invest our time and our energy, we need to remember that ultimately, social action is spiritual practice, and spiritual practice is social action. Thank you.